Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Another video for you. As promised, I said I was going to have at least two this week. And so here we are. Not yet sure if this is going to be exclusive for the subscribers or if this is going to be freely available to everybody. I guess it depends on how good it is. Um, Not really. We'll see. Anyway, I want to talk a little bit about economics to start with here. And then in the second half of the video, which hopefully will be fairly short, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that are going on in Ukraine on the battlefield. As always, I stress that in looking at the situation in Ukraine on the battlefield, we really have to kind of pull from a lot of different sources. And I would never pretend to be some military strategist or military expert. But I do think it's important that we pay attention to the developments day to day, week to week, and month to month in order to understand more broadly the political side of all of this, because ultimately that's what we're interested in. Anyway, let's focus on some economics first, though. I'm going to talk a little bit about this oil issue in Europe because it really is essentially a global issue, one that affects many others. So, the European Union, as I think you all probably know, has been discussing for a while now about the possibility of putting in a price cap on oil. I've done a lot of videos on this issue, including a detailed analysis of this a couple of months ago when it was first proposed. You can go over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Draitzer. You can find all of my videos there, including that one where I talk about the price cap. But to put it in a nutshell and to sort of summarize stuff that I've talked about before, basically what we're talking about is a cap on the price that can be paid to the Russians for oil imports, and in particular from this set of this new agreement. It is specific to seaborne imports of Russian oil. So, in other words, this is not directed at the oil that is pumped through pipelines into Europe, which is its own issue separate from this. But seaborne imports of Russian oil, according to this deal, will be capped at $60 a barrel. Now, this is supposed to be effective as of a couple of days ago, December 5th. I'm recording here on December 8th. This is a very interesting development because we can see the contours of some of the internal divides in Europe through the lens of this new package of, I guess you could call it sanctions, or it's really a cap that's in conjunction with the sanctions. Anyway, divided Europe into two camps, I think it's fairly clear. Poland and the Baltic states represent the real hawkish voices, those that want not only a price cap, but a price cap well below $60. In fact, they want a price cap of somewhere between $20 and $30, which is significantly below the cost of production, which is roughly at $40 a barrel. So if Poland and Estonia and Lithuania and Latvia got their way, then the cap would be so low as to make it unprofitable for Russia to sell its oil at all. Now, that is in contrast to the other camp, which includes those countries that are skeptical of these moves, like Hungary, and those countries that are kind of in a middle ground, like Germany and France, which both want to see a price cap, but also don't want to have to suffer the global economic ramifications of what Russia might do in response. So we're going to get to that in a second. But the first camp, as I mentioned, Poland and the Baltics. The second camp, France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, a number of other countries as well. They're obviously worried about the destabilization of the global economy and the global energy markets, which of course would benefit Russia. Increase of oil prices due to the instability and the fear of uncertain future, that's going to skyrocket prices, which is going to benefit the Russians, which is going to negate whatever pain they may have felt from the cap. So that is one of the major concerns. The other concern, of course, is that the fear that a major increase in the price because of Russia's counter moves is necessarily going to create political division in Europe, which is ultimately going to erode the alliance and backing of Ukraine. So there, in other words, the second camp has very real worries that this price cap could ultimately prove counterproductive. There are plenty of people, including on the left, who have made similar arguments with regard to sanctions on Russia as being ultimately counterproductive. Now, that being said, there have been some pretty good economic analysis on this that shows that that may not be true, that in fact Russia may in fact be getting a lot of the pain. We're just not seeing all of it. I suppose that debate continues to rage on. We don't have time to settle it here. But the $60 price cap seems to be more or less the consensus agreement. The consensus on this is helped by the fact that the sanctions that are already in place have more or less kind of created a soft price cap between the existing sanctions on Russian energy exports, as well as concerns about ESG, which is environmental and social governance, right? Which says, well, let me back up. ESG is basically the principle that says that major investors need to be wary of investing in environmentally damaging and or socially destructive investments in fossil fuels and other destructive type of investments. So anyway, ESG, and I've talked about this before. It's one of the reasons why the right-wing Republicans in the United States and the right-wing globally wants to get ESG removed from investment decision making, to get countries to essentially ban ESG decision making because they see it as woke investing. Of course, the Russians, for their part, like to fan the flames of that far right rhetoric because they themselves are on the receiving end of the negative effects of ESG investing. But anyway, I digress. Consensus on this is helped by the sanctions and by ESG concerns, wherein investors globally don't want to invest in Russia, irrespective of how profitable it may be because of these ESG concerns. Looking at the situation now, Russia's already, like I said, there's already a sort of a soft cap on Russian oil. Urals oil, which again, that's Russia's oil that is extracted out of the oil wells in the Ural Mountain region. The Urals oil is already selling roughly at $60 a barrel. So that cap is sort of already in place for Russian oil, 27 selling for 27% less than the Brent International Crude benchmark price. In other words, the Russians have been forced for various reasons to sell their oil at roughly a quarter discounted price, a 27% discount. That's already happening. This could potentially erode Russia's position further if these price caps go into effect and if they have the intended effect. Now, the question is, and this is an interesting one, and this goes to the heart of some of the debates in Europe, is the soft cap that's already in place, whereby Russia is forced to sell at these discounted prices, is that enough? Do you need the formal price cap if you already have this kind of informal price cap? And then the second issue that's kind of related to that is that the soft price cap that's already in place is already hurting Russia. It's hurting Russia in many different ways, including eroding Russia's position as a trading partner, including undermining Russia's cash revenue, cash reserves. Remember, Russia had so much of its foreign exchange reserves frozen when it invaded Ukraine. There's a whole host of economic dangers for Russia here. What's Russia's reaction? Well, there's a couple possibilities. It's not entirely clear, obviously, how Russia will react, but I guess you could say, the strategic planners, the economic planners, and so forth, they are looking at this and considering what might Russia do. One obvious reaction would be to simply shut off oil to those countries that are participating in this capping scheme, right? But the question is whether they would really do that, because although Russia would like to inflict some punishment on Europe and any countries that participate in this, it may not be able to. If it were to shut off the oil supplies to those countries, it would absolutely hurt the Russians. It would hit their total revenues at precisely the moment, as I just mentioned, at precisely the moment that foreign exchange reserves are falling. In the year 2022, Russia's foreign exchange cash reserves have dwindled. They've gone down by $100 billion year to date, and we still have 3 weeks left in the year. There's also the issue of storage. What are the Russians supposed to do? If they cut off the supplies to these European countries, they got to put the oil somewhere. If they don't have enough storage facilities, what are they going to do? Dump it into the ocean? Shoot it into outer space? I mean, there's only so many places you can stash, hundreds of thousands, millions of barrels of oil. Okay, so there's that issue. And then there's also the issue of future oil production. If Russia has nowhere to sell its oil and it doesn't have storage capacity, it's going to be forced to shut down some wells. Well, based on what we know of oil well production, you can't simply turn on and turn off oil wells. Once you cap the well and you turn it off, that's pretty much it. It doesn't come back online. In other words, Russia can't simply shut off oil production and then turn it back on. Okay, so it's a complicated situation for the Russians as it pertains to, what their counter moves might be. Now, the issue really that I want to focus on here with the last couple of minutes on this story is what the Putin cheerleaders have to say, or rather, how they misunderstand and misread the situation. What they don't understand is that market forces already in effect have essentially mitigated Russia's ability to use oil as a weapon. Okay, so they can't really do that because in order for the Russians to really use oil as a weapon, they have to be willing to see supply cuts. Those supply cuts, further beyond what they've already cut, are going to create a sort of negative feedback to Russia. Let me explain what I mean. Russia cut off the gas supplies to Germany. As we know, the whole debacle over Nord Stream, the shutting off of Nord Stream 1 for, you know, allegedly maintenance issues, followed by the attack on the pipeline itself. All of that has led to not Germany freezing to death necessarily. The German economy hasn't collapsed. What has happened is you've seen a 25 to 30% reduction in energy demand in Germany. Now, this is, of course, because of the German government's you know, energy savings programs, forced energy savings programs, forced rationing of energy, etc. Right? I'm not suggesting that there aren't negative effects of this. Of course, there are, but in the grand scheme of things, rather than freezing the Germans, the Russians have forced the Germans to decrease their energy demand. That, of course, is leading to global growth slowing in this recessionary cycle that we're in, which of course is weighing down energy prices. So, in other words, by the Russians forcing the Germans to reduce their demand by cutting off the energy, they've now cut off their nose to spite their face, because that then leads to reduced demand, which then leads to lagging oil and gas prices. Okay, so Russia is not outside of the sort of feedback loop of its own, of the sort of negative effects of its own policies. Let's put it that way. Global growth is slowing down. We see this in many different ways across many different sectors, across many different parts of the world. And with that, energy prices seem to be also slacking, right? So, again, Russia is in an awkward situation. Now, speaking of awkward situations related to energy, there's a story that broke this week that I think got missed by a lot of people. And I think it's very, very important to understanding everything related to Russia, Ukraine, China, and everything we've been talking about here. The story that didn't really get much attention comes out of Qatar, and it is not related to the World Cup. Everyone is obviously focused on the World Cup for the most obvious reasons. But another story out of Qatar was this massive 27-year deal signed between Qatar and China to deliver liquefied natural gas, LNG, from Qatar to China. Okay, $400 billion deal, 27-year term on this contract. It is the longest and largest LNG deal that has ever been signed, ever. Okay, now Qatar is the world's number one supplier of LNG, liquefied natural gas. The Chinese are coming to Qatar to purchase LNG. Where are they not going? To Russia. Why? It seems fairly clear, and I'm going to talk about this a little further. The Chinese have, I think, come to their senses a little bit when it comes to how closely to align with Russia versus the United States, the West, and more broadly, much of the rest of the world that is aligned with the West. Okay, Qatar, I think, represents a very obvious example of China moving away from Russia's camp and into a middle camp, a middle ground between the two, what have you, which is obviously the position that I expected China to be in all along. The smart move for Beijing was never to get too close to Moscow or to Washington, but rather to play mediator, to play middle ground, and to present itself as the only true arbiter in this new and indecipherable global chessboard or what have you, right? But the Chinese didn't do that. Xi Jinping stood shoulder to shoulder with Putin, talked about the forever friendship between the countries, and on and on and on, yada, yada, yada. Ultimately, in my view, that was a tremendous blunder by China. It threw away a golden opportunity that China had to announce itself globally as not just second fiddle to the United States, but perhaps even having surpassed the United States in its diplomatic and political capabilities, the capability to establish peace, things like that. So it seems like we're seeing indications now that China has finally realized that and is beginning to move in that direction. So this is the second deal between China and a major energy supplier in the Persian Gulf. Don't forget, in 2020, China signed a massive deal with Iran that was worth also $400 billion. Okay, so it seems like it's a magic number. So China is now in bed energy wise with Iran and with Qatar. Iran and Qatar are allies against Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and the Egyptians, and of course, Russia, which backs the UAE and the Saudis and other interests, Syria, of course, other interests as well. The Israelis are kind of also playing a middle ground between Russia and the United States. Netanyahu, famously close to Putin. Obviously, there's the Trump and Kushner connection. We don't have time to get into all of that. But what I'm trying to get at here is that the Middle East and the Persian Gulf in particular is now a battleground, and it is not just a battleground between Russia and the United States. China is in on the action, and China is not playing ball with Russia when it comes to the chessboard of the Persian Gulf. This is showing us that there is clearly a strategic partnership between China and Qatar, which is interesting considering there's a strategic partnership between Qatar and the United States. Okay, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. You have many areas. I'm only going to focus on a couple, but there are others. Many areas where China and Qatar are clearly having overlapping interests. Let's focus on two of them. One I already mentioned is Iran. Of course, Iran and Saudi Arabia have long since been rivals. Saudi Arabia and the UAE on one hand, Iran on the other. Qatar, remember, refused to sever ties with Iran in 2017, which led to a blockade of Qatar by Saudis, UAE, and Egypt. That, of course, was lifted in 2021, which was the end of that long running sort of diplomatic feud. But what it shows us, though, is that both Iran and Qatar have this. Well, we know they have a shared gas field in the Persian Gulf, which they both draw upon. And it also shows that they have a common set of enemies, namely those three countries that I mentioned, the UAE, the Saudis, and the Egyptians. Behind that axis is the Russians to a large extent. You have this shared position on Iran because both Qatar and China are very close to Iran and see Iran as part of their overall regional strategy. China refused to go along with the United States in sanctioning Iran. Refused, in fact, continued to buy oil from Iran, all the while the Biden administration was trying to restart the nuclear talks. The Iranians and the Chinese continued to do business all through that period, despite pleas from Washington for the Chinese to move away from Tehran. Qatar also refused to cut ties with Iran, as I mentioned, and led to that blockade. From the other side, the Chinese have their own ambitions. They want a military base in the Persian Gulf. This is well known, well understood, and Qatar might ultimately prove to be a very good candidate for the Chinese military base. Of course, we could think about Djibouti, for example, in the Horn of Africa, as playing something like a similar role to what Qatar might play in this scenario. Qatar uh, also represents a major focal point for, well, for the Chinese, but also for others with respect to Afghanistan. Remember that it is in Doha, in Qatar, where the Taliban has had an office since 2013. It is the Chinese who kept traveling to Doha to open up lines of communication with the Taliban, knowing that eventually the United States would pull out, which of course it ultimately did under the Biden administration. That then left Qatar as the U.S. representative in Afghanistan. It is not the United States that speaks to the Taliban on U.S. interests. It is Qatar on behalf of the United States representing U.S. interests in Afghanistan. So you have Qatar and China together really representing the closest link to the Taliban in Afghanistan. And both of those countries clearly positioning themselves for any potential Taliban consolidation of power in Afghanistan, which would then make China a major player in that country, major player for iron ore, for minerals, for energy, for trade routes, for all sorts of things that the Chinese want out of Afghanistan. Qatar represents a major node in the Chinese strategy. Now, don't forget, Turkey has a base in Qatar. So there's already precedent for foreign military bases in Qatar. Turkey has it. China may soon have that as well. All of this is to say that, boy, this is complicating the picture when it comes to the Ukraine war. Everyone wanted to assume it was nice and clean, that the Chinese and the Russians were in one camp and the West was in the other. But evidence doesn't seem to support that. In fact, I would say the evidence seems to show China moving away from the Russians. And this gas deal, I think, is a perfect example of that. All right, let's now turn to a couple of issues on the ground. I'm going to talk. Uh, let me talk about an article that was in Foreign Affairs. I'm not going to get into all of the details here. It does go into some of the history of Crimea. I don't have time for all of that right now. I just want to talk a little bit about the strategy and whether or not Ukraine might actually retake Crimea. So the question really comes down to whether or not liberating Crimea from Russian control is something that is A, on the table, and B, is it comparable to the Ukrainian counteroffensive that liberated Kherson? Well, I mean, the argument is made in the article in Foreign Affairs, and I agree with the overall thrust of the article, which is that Crimea means a hell of a lot more to Putin and to Russia than Kherson ever could. In other words, the Russians would pay a very, very high price to keep control over Crimea, a price that they were never willing to pay to control Kherson. So that should color, at least to some degree, the thinking about what Ukraine's strategy should be. So the argument is, and it's embedded in the title of the article, go slow on Crimea. So, Ukrainian officials at various times after the counteroffensive successfully in September and October have said that, Crimea by December was the call, right? That Crimea would be liberated from Russian occupation by the end of the year. Well, we're rapidly approaching the end of the year, and that seems rather unlikely. But if you look at the situation, it makes sense why it's unlikely. Putin can lose Kherson and survive politically. Putin could probably even lose Donetsk and Lugansk and survive politically. But there is no chance that Putin could survive politically if he were to lose Crimea. Crimea is the centerpiece of the entire Putin regime strategy of the last decade or so. So to lose it would be impossible. It is unthinkable for the Russians, and they would commit massive resources to defending Crimea from Ukraine. So if you look at the map, you can see just from a strategic perspective why Crimea is so important for the Russians. Crimea acts as essentially a dagger pointed at both the Black Sea and also at Kiev. This is a dagger that could basically be used at any time. As we see, Russia has used Sevastopol, the naval base, and the various military facilities in Crimea as the launching point for almost all of its attacks into Ukraine. So you could see that Crimea is the centerpiece of a military strategy. Without Russian control of Crimea, it would be very difficult, if not impossible, for Russia to be able to project its military power into Ukraine or really anywhere around the Black Sea. Think other countries like Turkey, which also is, of interest to Russia. I've talked at length in various videos about the Russia Turkey cooperation slash competition. And I think that, again, Crimea plays a big role in that. Look, I don't have to go back. I don't have to be a historian. We know there was a Crimean War fought between the British and the Russians to control Crimea as they picked clean the bones of the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire. So this history goes back several centuries. Okay, so Turkey also should be thought of in this whole equation. Certainly, Putin is thinking about it. Okay, Ukraine has showed that Crimea is vulnerable. We've seen attacks, both the drone attacks that have that have successfully attacked several military installations in Crimea, and also, of course, we had the very high profile strike on the Kerch Bridge, which connects Crimea to mainland Russia. So both of those examples, I think, show us that Crimea is vulnerable and probably, I think, builds some confidence on the Ukrainian side that they actually could attack and take Crimea. At the same time, though, I think we have to be sort of, you know, sober and thinking about, well, what would it actually mean? This would be where Russia would escalate. Russia's not just going to sit back and retreat from Crimea the way they did in Kherson. This is a question of conquering Crimea, versus pinning the Russians in Crimea. The military strategy seems to dictate that the prudent move would be not to retake Crimea, but to force the Russians to commit major resources to holding Crimea, essentially pinning the Russians against Crimea, giving the Ukrainians a much stronger negotiating position. If the Russians fear that at any moment Ukrainian soldiers might break through and ultimately full on, have a full on battle for Crimea, if the Russians fear that scenario, maybe they will be a little more motivated to come to the negotiating table in good faith, and maybe they'll be a little more motivated to listen to some of Ukraine's demands. Ukraine would also then be probably engaged in breaking up the land bridge that the Russians have tried to establish to Crimea through Kherson, through the south of the country. Obviously, when we look at the map and we could see where Mariupol is, where Kherson is, where Odessa is, where Crimea is, you can see the importance of this southern Ukrainian land bridge. And obviously, the Ukrainian military would commit resources to breaking that up in this scenario. Retaking Crimea would undoubtedly be extremely dangerous. As I mentioned, the Russians would commit resources to defending Crimea that they were never willing to commit to defending other territory. The danger really is that attacking Crimea and either losing or ending in some kind of a stalemate could potentially jeopardize some of the other gains that Ukraine has made. And in fact, it might even potentially jeopardize the entire counteroffensive. So the real ultimate question is, what does Ukraine do with Crimea? Does Ukraine attack Crimea? Does Ukraine hold on, wait to attack Crimea, see if they can use it for the purposes of leveraging a better negotiated deal? It remains to be seen. I think the United States is fairly clear here that they are nervous, extremely nervous about Ukraine launching any kind of forays into Crimea, because again, it leads us down the path of forcing a Russian escalation. That's what Biden, I think, fears above all else. All right. Final story I want to talk about here today has to do with another battlefield reality, and that is drones. I've talked about drones as well. You can find that on the Patreon page. But the issue of drones is interesting because the Russians don't really have their own drones, so that's where the Iranian drones have come into play. But experts who are looking at the drone situation are beginning to raise questions about those Iranian drones' viability in cold weather having already set in Ukraine. part of the reason why we haven't seen those Iranian drones since mid-November's attacks is, at least some believe, because they can't operate successfully in the cold weather, in the frost, in the snow, etc. So, what does that mean? That means that we might be headed into a lull when it comes to the drones from the Russian side. The Kremlin looks like they're grounding those Iranian drones. As I mentioned, mid November, when they struck Kiev and some of those other cities, that was the last time that we saw those Iranian drones used in any significant capacity. Now, we should note that what Russia was using the drones for was not, I mean, not, well, let me put it this way: everything Russia has done is illegal. Everything Russia has done since its invasion is illegal. The invasion itself is illegal, a war crime of the highest order. All of the attacks that Russia has carried out, they're subsequent war crimes subordinate to the initial war crime of having launched the war. Okay, but some war crimes are even more egregious than others, and the Russians, their targeting of critical civilian infrastructure like the electrical grid, heating, water systems, sewage systems, etc. These attacks, which are all war crimes, they are carried out primarily by drones. Okay, so now the question is, are the Russians still going to be able to pound civilian infrastructure in Ukraine if their drones are grounded? That's a very real question. The other issue here is that the Russians were kind of sort of using drones as a substitute for missiles and rockets because those missile and rocket stockpiles seem to have been dwindling. So now do the Russians step up their attacks with missiles and rockets now that the drones have been grounded? That's another question that needs to be monitored. On the other side, much of Ukraine has been without power because of those Russian attacks on the electrical grid, and the UK intelligence and the UK military has suggested that the Russians are running low on drones. So it remains to be seen whether the British are correct or not, but it does seem, at least some believe, the Russians are running low on drones, and so they're maybe holding them in reserve and using some of those rockets instead. Now, finally, the issue of Turkish drones is important. I've talked about this many times before. Just a couple of months before the Russian invasion, Erdogan, the president of Turkey, swooped to Ukraine to sign a deal with Zelensky to build a drone factory outside of Kiev where they were going to produce advanced Bayraktar style drones. The Bayraktar drones have been used by Ukraine, those that they purchased from Turkey. They've been used by Ukraine specifically targeting Russian tank columns successfully. So, the Ukrainians have a limited number of those Turkish drones, and the recent attacks that the Ukrainians have successfully carried out have mostly been using Soviet era reconnaissance drones that are basically you know, packed with explosives and used as, kamikaze drones, which are basically like rockets or missiles, right? These are Soviet era drones, the Tupolev Tu-141S, and they get loaded with explosives. This is as low tech as could possibly be. It was low tech in the 1980s. It's even lower tech now. But that's what the Ukrainians have. That's what they're using. And ironically, as was noted in the article that I was looking at, ironically, those drones were built in a factory in Kharkiv, which is now delivering drones to liberate itself, to liberate that territory. So, anyway, there is a drone war within the broader war, which is a war within a war within a war, kind of, like one of those Matryoshka's dolls, But the irony is obviously not lost on me. So, anyway, that's all I have for today. Thank you, as always, for the continued support. Go over to Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Draitzer. Go over to the Counterpunch page, Counterpunch. Get a subscription to Counterpunch Plus. Really appreciate those of you who have done that, who support that very important political project that I'm involved with. And of course, as always, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, continue pushing for peace, and we will talk again very soon.